written statement by Representative Kathy Cass. To the electronic repository at HNRC docs at mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. And as with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. Thank you for that, and thank you for joining us at this hearing. Let me recognize myself for the opening statement, and I'll...
Chair,
yeah.
can you help us? Sorry, this is Laura. The audio is not working on the streaming device right now. So can you hold just 1 second, please?
Do I need to begin from get-go on calling the meeting to order and everything?
Sarah Lim, what do you think? No, you're good.
Okay, that got done.
Perfect time for you to give your speech.
I just got a note, the audio is back.
Okay.
So we can start.
We apologize for the technical glitch, but let me recognize myself for the opening statement and then recognize the ranking member or his designee. Thank you to all the members of Congress and witnesses for joining us today as we have a conversation about my bill, the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act. At over 300 pages long, the bill includes a number of provisions, many of which are bipartisan, to address the very serious problem of climate change. As the incoming Biden administration is going through its transition process, we must lay the groundwork to address climate change with the speed that this crisis demands. Turning to the legislation, the idea here is simple. A healthy ocean can help us fight the climate crisis. Our ocean has absorbed over 1/3 of our carbon emissions and 90% of the excess heat we have generated. This has consequences, which has resulted in ocean acidification, sea level rise, shifting fish stocks, coral reef die-offs, and much more. The ocean and atmosphere are closely connected, which is good news for us. Scientists have found that 21% of the carbon equation can be solved globally through the ocean. But climate proposals have ignored the ocean for far too long. That's why we have put forward the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, a bill that provides a roadmap for ocean and coastal climate resilience and curbs greenhouse gases. Since this bill is the first of its kind, we continue to expect and welcome feedback. I look forward to working with all of you to improve this legislation as it goes forward. The bill develops a plan to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030, which is good for everybody. A new study finds that expanding existing global marine protected areas by just 5% can improve future fisheries catch by at least 20%. The bill also prepares our fisheries and blue economy for climate change, improves coastal zone management, strengthens marine mammal conservation, and confronts ocean acidification and harmful algal blooms. It improves coastal resilience and specifically promotes resilience and justice for U.S. territories, indigenous people, and communities of color. Critically, the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act captures and reduces carbon dioxide by creating a pathway forward for renewable offshore energy and enhances national carbon capture and storage in ocean ecosystems like seagrass beds, kelp forests, and mangroves, and a concept known as blue carbon. The way I look at it, we are in a reciprocal relationship with nature. You reap what you sow. Greedy polluters have harmed our planet for decades, and now we are all having to deal with the consequences. But with solutions like this legislation and other proposals to confront climate change, we can do and will do better. The legislation is a compilation of the work of many of my colleagues. Representative Bonamici, Representative Seth Melton, Representative Don Beyer, Representative Charlie Crist, Representative Debbie Scott Powell, Representative Anthony Brown, Representative Holland, Representative Lowenthal, and Representative Velasquez. So to them, I thank them for their work on the pieces of the legislation, their legislation that has been incorporated into the overall bill. With that, let me now, the chair will recognize the ranking member or his designee for the opening statement. Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this this hearing in such a manner that easily produces interaction and understanding of the issues that we are facing. Before I actually begin my comments, I would ask unanimous consent that 3 documents be added to the record. I think you all have them electronically already. One is a letter of opposition to HR 8632 that's signed by 831 organizations. Basically, anyone who knows about fishing, uses fishing, or eats fish is in opposition. The second is a letter of the Family Farm Alliance expressing concerns over the impact on Western agriculture. Third letter from Stronger America Through Seafood also expresses their concerns with HR 8632. Now, Mr. Chairman and members of our wonderful committee, today we meet what will be likely the last Natural Resources Committee hearing of the 116th Congress. Go outside, Don. We're considering 9 bills, most of which are included in the chairman's HR 8632. There really is no reason to have added or for Watkins to add to this hearing unless it's to give members another 5 minutes to campaign or speak on the bills. It's kind of a waste of time, but I would remind you all that the election is over. We should move on. Jessica Hathaway, the editor-in-chief of National Fishermen, described the chairman's bill perfectly when she wrote that reading its 324 pages felt like swinging at a piñata packed with a mix of treats and lit fireworks. I think Hathaway has got it perfectly. The bill authorizes billions in new grants and programs to distract from the economically devastating policies that are also being pushed in this bill. Majority is pushing a so-called 30 by 30 idea, blocking up 30% of our oceans by 2030, all under the guise of protecting biodiversity while tackling climate change. The reality is really much different. Policy is woefully misguided. It does not improve fisheries. It undermines the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and even worse, it's detrimental to American, especially American fishermen. Our fisheries are not on the brink of collapse. According to NOAA, 91% of the stocks of which we have assessments are not subject to overfishing. Further, nearly 90% of the federal mandated fisheries fall below their annual catch limits, meaning that our commercial and recreational fishermen are not being allowed to harvest at maximum sustainable levels. Dr. Hilborn, who is one of our distinguished guests here today, a marine biologist and fisheries scientist, University of Washington, has stated that the major threat to sustainable jobs, food, recreational opportunities, and revenue from U.S. marine fisheries is not overfishing, but underfishing. I look forward to his testimony as we realize once again what that actually means, and that we maybe are looking at things as we did in the past, not what is presently needed, and definitely not for what the future requires. So I think it's worth repeating. The Magnuson-Stevens Act is not just for the conservation and management of fishery resources, but also to assure that our citizens benefit from employment, food supply, and revenue, which could be generated from these resources. Just like locking up large sums of land has been a terrible and expensive idea, locking up 30% of our oceans does not translate into good stewardship. There are better ways of managing our fishery resources. Again, the Magnuson-Stevens Act that did not put an industry, again, the Magnuson-Stevens Act is what we're talking about. And that does not put the industry that supports 1.6 million US jobs at risk. I would be remiss if I didn't point out the timing of this bill. Our fishing industry has been hard hit by COVID-19. Instead of helping, it seems the majority is more interested in pushing fishermen's livelihood at risk in the name of faux conservation. And lastly, I want to point out this bill bankrupts the LWCF by banning its main revenue source. Mr. Grijalva has constantly reminded us that LWCF is one of the nation's bedrock conservation laws. I want to remind him that OCS revenues provides 100% of the funding for the LWCF, as well as significant revenues to the Gulf of of Mexico coastal states for coastal restoration. This ban is even more ridiculous after we just locked in mandatory spending of $900 million in perpetuity in the Not So Great American Outdoors Act. So with that, let the festivities begin. Thank you for letting me see you on my screen, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Bishop. And a point of personal privilege, and you mentioned that this might be the last possible hearing that we have before a new Congress and a new session. And I just want to take this personal time, Mr. Bishop, to thank you for your service to Congress and to this committee. And both as chairman and ranking member of Resources Committee, it's been a pleasure and a chore to work with you all these years. And I think it is important to note, as I've noted in the past, that you've been a consistent voice for your point of view and the philosophy, and one can ask no more of a representative but to be consistent. And I want to thank you for that, and wish you the best. And let me now introduce the witnesses, if I may, for this hearing. Our first witness is Dr. Jane Lubachenko, a University of Distinguished Professor of Marine Biology at Oregon State University. Followed by her, we will hear from Dr. Kelsey Leonard, Steering Committee Member, Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, enrolled citizen of Shinnecock Indian Nation. Next, we will be Dr. Ray Hilborn, a professor of the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington. And finally, our last witness will be Dr. Kelly Chris, Director of Ocean Policy at the New England Aquarium. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral presentation to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear as part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin and it will turn orange. When you have 1 minute remaining, I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use grid view so they may pin the timer on their screen. And your testimony, as your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before the questioning of the witnesses begins by members. But now, I will now recognize Dr. Lubachenko to testify, and the time is yours.
Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I'm an ocean ecologist. I study connections in ecosystems, including interactions between people and their ecosystems. When I read the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, I saw oceans of opportunity for exciting, urgently needed progress on climate change, but much more as well. You are all painfully aware and have mentioned some of the multiple crises facing the nation and the world. With COVID-19, we're facing an unprecedented health crisis that has also triggered an economic crisis. The racial injustice crisis, long ignored, has burst onto the national conscience. We know there's a biodiversity crisis on land and in the ocean, and multiple threats have produced an ocean crisis. And of course, the climate crisis that brings us together today. Each of these 6 crises is complex and demands attention. Making serious headway with any of them is tough, but taken together, they might seem impossible. But what if we could find synergies that would allow us to address multiple crises at the same time? Now, that would be worth doing. This bill provides just such an opportunity with obvious synergies between the ocean and the climate crisis. True, the ocean has been mostly out of sight, out of mind in dialogues about climate mitigation. We've focused primarily on land-based opportunities to produce renewable energy, enable more efficient transportation, buildings, and appliances, and tap nature-based solutions through forest action. But now, Thanks to new analyses from scientists organized for the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, we know that the ocean also has powerful solutions that might provide as much as 20% of the emission reductions we need to achieve the 1.5 degree target by 2050. And until recently, these solutions were not even on our radar screens. Multiple ocean-based climate actions are ripe for action. You have begun the exciting process to realize their potential. Renewable ocean energy, decarbonizing shipping, tapping the power of blue carbon ecosystems, encouraging consumption of sustainable seafood instead of animal protein from the land, and protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030 are all powerful, timely actions. Together, they provide both mitigation and adaptation solutions. But if we are smart about tapping this ocean climate synergy, we can also achieve even greater benefits across other urgent crises. For example, economic stimulus funds could be put to excellent use to create the jobs needed to protect and restore seagrass beds, salt marshes, and mangroves. These blue carbon wetlands would remove massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, climate mitigation benefit. Restored wetlands would be a boon to the commercial and recreational fisheries by restoring critically important nursery areas, bringing economic and social benefit. Restored wetlands provide wildlife habitat, creating biodiversity benefit. They provide recreational opportunities, providing health and economic benefit. And those same restored wetlands also provide buffers against storm surge, resulting in climate adaptation and resilience benefit. Finally, if done smartly, many of those jobs and outcomes could benefit communities of color. So, with just this one example, we see exciting possibilities to derive powerful co-benefits that address the economic, social justice, biodiversity, and ocean crises. A quintuple win-win-win-win-win. Talk about synergies. Marine protected areas provide another strong pathway to achieve multiple benefits, including both mitigation and adaptation benefit, while also creating jobs, protecting biodiversity, enhancing resilience, protecting carbon stores, and providing recreational benefit. When crises loom, what is needed most is knowledge that there is light at the end of the tunnel, hope. This bill provides hope because it provides a pathway for tackling multiple crises simultaneously. The time for climate action is now, using the full suite of tools to achieve the greatest social, economic, and environmental benefit. Thank you.
Recognize Dr. Leonard. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of the House Committee on Natural Resources. Tabutni, thank you for this opportunity to testify on ocean policy solutions for coastal resiliency and for your dedicated work and the work of your staff in bringing this bill together. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo and have served since 2013 in a regional ocean planning capacity as a former tribal co-lead for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Planning Body, and now as a member of the steering committee for the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean. I speak before you today not only as a water scientist and legal scholar, but as a Shinnecock woman. Although I should note that I am not here in an official capacity as a tribal governmental representative. However, I am an enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Indian Nation. Our territory is located on the eastern end of Long Island, New York, and we are a coastal tribal nation that has existed on our Aboriginal lands and waters for more than 10,000 years. Shinnecock in our language means people of the shore. We are water people, we are fishermen and baymen and have harvested the bounty of the sea since time immemorial. But above all, we are ocean protectors. In 2012, when Superstorm Sandy hit our community and countless other communities along the Atlantic coast, we knew climate change would have irreparable consequences for our territory if we did not take swift action to address the climate crisis. Increasing extreme storm events mean more flooding, saltwater intrusion, infrastructure vulnerabilities, power outages, and the potential for loss of life. Eastern tribal nations were severely impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and some reservations, like my own, went weeks without power. With rising sea levels, tribal nations are on the front lines of coastal communities with little protection within existing legislation for adaptation and capacity building. This is why we need the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act. I go into more detail in my written testimony, but I would like to highlight a few high-level points with you today. Global studies have found that nearly 80% of the world's land-based biodiversity is located on indigenous peoples' territories. And if the United States is to set a national goal of conserving at least 30% of the land and 30% of the ocean by 2030, that goal should also support tribal sovereignty and indigenous-led conservation. Protection of land and ocean areas should not limit tribal access to food sovereignty, stewardship practices, or maintenance of heritage sites and cultural resources. As indigenous peoples, our communities cannot benefit from the ocean-based solutions presented in the bill if we are not counted. Data collection and monitoring of the Great Lakes, oceans, bays, estuaries, and coasts must be done in consultation with tribal nations and align with indigenous data sovereignty principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Our role as tribal nations is not that of stakeholder, but of sovereigns and rights holders in a government-to-government relationship with the United States. As former tribal co-lead for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Planning Body, I saw firsthand the shift in ocean governance when intergovernmental coordination is mandated and tribal nations are included in equal parity to state and federal representatives. Tribes should not be made to compete with state governments for funds to conserve ocean ecosystems. The Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act fills a gap in the Coastal Zone Management Act, where previously tribal nations were ineligible to access CZMA funds. This type of funding would allow tribal nations such as Shinnecock to continue our coastal habitat restoration work and build shoreline resiliency through nature-based solutions that are grounded in our indigenous knowledge systems. As Shinnecock people, we have a deep cultural connection to whales, and the recent unusual mortality events in mid-North Atlantic waters have terrified our community and other indigenous communities in the region. I believe the whale is like a miner's canary, a foreboding and sacrificing alarm of our current climate crisis, and the need to take immediate action not only to protect our whale relatives, but the planet. I want to conclude today by sharing one remaining story from my community, the Shinnecock Nation. Like many coastal communities, if sea levels continue to rise, half our reservation could be inundated by water by 2050. With a growing population and a depleting land base and no existing legislative process for relocation of tribal nations to lands of cultural patrimony where we would retain our land status, what will become of us? We echo the calls of our Pacific Island brothers and sisters. We are not drowning, we are fighting, and we need the federal government to fight for us. Tabutni, and thank you for your time today.
Very much, Dr. Let me now turn to and recognize Dr. Hilbar for his testimony. Thank you, Doctor.
Mr. Chairman and members, thank you for this opportunity to address the committee on this important issue. As someone who has worked in fisheries for over 50 years and done field work in Alaska for almost 40 years, I know that global warming is real and climate change is the major challenge to American fisheries. The question is, what are the most appropriate tools to respond? Before we discuss how to respond to climate change, we first need to set the stage. What's the state of U.S. fisheries and oceans? U.S. fish stocks are healthy and increasing in abundance, and U.S. fisheries management is highly precautionary. A recent paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed that overfishing is causing only a 3 to 5% loss in potential yield from U.S. fisheries, whereas precautionary underfishing is causing far more loss of yield. Overfishing is simply not a concern for U.S. fisheries production. Science-based management under the Magnuson-Stevens Act is working. So how should we respond to the challenges of climate change? The U.S. has an admirable set of laws and institutions that can do this. The regional fisheries management councils have the authority and the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and other legislation give councils the tools to respond to climate change. We don't need a fixed set of closed areas. We need adaptive response to climate. In the years ahead, it will be important for fisheries management to be more flexible, allowing for changes in the distribution and productivity of marine species. Areas and stocks that are high priority for protection now may not be the same in 20 years. This brings me to Title II of the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, which would require establishment of marine protected areas that ban all commercial fishing activity in 30% of U.S. ocean waters by 2030. Such fixed marine protected areas are simply the wrong tool to adapt to climate change. There are three primary objectives in the 30 by 30 proposal. One, to increase target species production. Two, to better protect non-target species. And three, to protect sensitive habitats. MPAs will either not help achieve these objectives or there are far better tools. Both theory and empirical evidence shows you cannot increase target species yield with MPAs unless overfishing is widespread. This is not the case in the US. We would not expect MPAs to increase the yield from our fish stocks. Certainly there are typically more fish in closed areas than outside, but remember that the fishing effort that was previously inside the MPA has been moved outside. The evidence shows that when MPAs are put in place and stocks are well managed, abundance goes up in the closed area, but goes down outside with no net gain. MPAs would help to increase yield in places where overfishing is common, such as South and Southeast Asia, but not the US. It has been clearly demonstrated that bycatch can be best reduced by changes in fishing technology, fishing gear, or changes in incentives to alter fleet behavior. Bycatch reduction of 90% has been achieved by turtle excluder devices for trawls, acoustic pingers for gill nets, and a combination of tory lines, change in bait, circle hooks, and night setting for long lines. The spatial location of bycatch problems will change as species distribution changes. Closing fixed areas of the oceans based on current distributions will not be effective. Certainly vulnerable marine ecosystems need protection, but fishery management councils are doing that in a way that is science-based and has credibility with industry and other stakeholders. These areas should be mapped and protected from fishing gear that impacts benthic organisms, but the distribution of these species may well shift with climate change, and fixed closed areas are not the right tool. MPA's advocates argue that areas with no fishing are more resilient to climate change than fished areas, but they ignore the fact that a 30 by 30 would cause 70% of US oceans to see increased fishing pressure from vessels that move out of the 30% closed. Thus, if the areas inside the reserve are more resilient, the areas outside would be less resilient. Do we really want to make 70% of our oceans less resilient to climate change? For none of these issues are no-take areas the most appropriate tool, but the proposed legislation would draw staff time, resources, and industry engagement away from the really effective tools. MPAs will also not help other threats to the ocean, such as ocean acidification, exotic species, land-based runoff, plastics, or illegal fishing. I certainly agree with my colleagues in the environmental movement that we need protection of our oceans, but Title II takes the wrong approach, and we can do better if we apply the same resources that tools will work. Let councils use the effective tools to protect 100% of the US oceans, not apply an ineffective tool to 30%. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hilbert, for your testimony. And now let me recognize Dr. Chris for that testimony. You recognize.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Bishop, and all of the committee members for inviting me to testify on the topic of ocean climate action. As a former resident of Arizona, a non-ocean state, I want to acknowledge Chairman Grijalva's leadership in introducing this bill and recognizing that no matter where we reside, a healthy and thriving ocean is critical to all of us. I'm Dr. Kelly Chris, the Director of Ocean Policy at the New England Aquarium in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm also an oceanographer and a geoscientist. My career has focused on both the energy and environmental sides of climate. And although I currently serve in a role advocating for a healthy ocean, I also have experience working with the energy sector to achieve a balance between energy extraction and protecting the environment, conserving natural resources, and promoting safety. I'm testifying today in support of H.R. 8632. On the whole, the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act proposes a comprehensive yet pragmatic framework for taking immediate action to limit the impacts of the climate crisis by harnessing the power of the ocean. Let me be clear. The provisions outlined in the bill are absolutely necessary if we are to prevent the worst of what has been predicted under a business-as-usual scenario. The evidence is overwhelming. We must severely curb emissions of greenhouse gases, and we need to do it now. Prohibiting new offshore oil and gas leasing while simultaneously enhancing offshore wind energy production will help the United States meet its energy needs as the country works to achieve its climate targets. In 2018, when the Trump administration announced a draft plan to open nearly the entire U.S. outer continental shelf for potential oil and gas lease sales, the aquarium opposed this course of action because of the risks posed to the ocean and coastal communities that depend on it for their living. We still oppose any new oil and gas activities offshore. Despite our reservations related to offshore oil and gas development, the aquarium fully supports the development of offshore renewable wind energy, with the caveat that the industry use the best available science to inform the siting, construction, and ongoing operation of the platforms. While we recognize that offshore wind will likely impact the marine environment, we support this because climate change represents a much greater threat to the ocean and its wildlife. Furthermore, by conducting scientific research, exercising the precautionary principle, and making decisions informed by the best scientific information available, we believe that the benefits of offshore wind in mitigating climate change far outweigh the costs. One of the potential costs that the aquarium is deeply vested in is the fate of the endangered North Atlantic right whale. Ensuring the ongoing recovery of vulnerable marine mammal populations is an essential component of any ocean-based solution to climate change. This bill addresses the important issue of marine mammal mortality caused by lethal strikes with vessels transiting the animals' habitats. In 2020 alone, 2 young endangered North Atlantic right whales were killed by vessel strikes. The current estimate of remaining North Atlantic right whales dropped to just 366 animals in 2020. The bill's solution to reduce shipping speeds in U.S. waters addresses 3 complementary issues. First, slowing ships down directly reduces carbon emissions. Second, slower vessel speeds are proven to reduce the lethality of strikes with marine mammals. Third, slower vessel speeds reduce underwater noise through decreased propeller cavitation, which improves marine mammals' abilities to communicate and navigate. The aquarium supports the bill's provision establishing a nationwide voluntary ship slowdown program and encourages the committee to consider mandatory speed restrictions in areas where right whales are present. Taken together, the provisions in this title of the bill will make a meaningful difference in securing the health of marine mammals, which will ensure that they continue providing climate benefits as carbon reservoirs and fertilizers of the ocean. In closing, the aquarium is grateful to the chairman and the committee for their leadership on addressing ocean-based solutions to climate change. As an ocean scientist and an ocean advocate, I personally am grateful for the opportunity to shift the narrative of the ocean as a victim of the climate crisis to the ocean as the hero in this story. The solutions detailed in this bill should be implemented sooner rather than later to reduce the intensity of projected climate impacts and set us on a sustainable path where humans find balance with the planet. Thank you again for inviting me to serve as a witness in support of this important and groundbreaking legislation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Chris, and I want to thank the panel for their testimonies and reminding members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. I will not recognize myself at this point, but afford the members that are here that are participating in hearing the opportunity to make their statements, ask their questions. And let me begin with Representative Huffman. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your leadership in pulling this bill together, bringing it forward to this hearing. Also want to thank the committee staff for their work on what is a very big, very ambitious, comprehensive bill that incorporates a lot of good science-based ideas on how to tackle climate change through our oceans. Many of these ideas were raised by the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, where I've served in this Congress, to raise awareness of the dangers of continued offshore drilling, as well as possible solutions such as blue carbon, which I'm pleased to see reflected in this bill. Also pleased that the bill contains a prohibition on new oil and gas leasing in all areas of the outer continental shelf, which would include two areas that I've been fighting to protect, the West Coast and the Arctic. We are all aware of the impacts of the climate crisis and the need for bold, progressive legislation. In my district and also across the country, coastal communities are all too familiar with the consequences of inaction, whether it's sea level rise, ocean heat waves, or loss of important coastal habitat. We're facing a dire situation, and this legislation is a starting point. It's a set of proposals that includes tangible solutions to not only protect our ocean resources and biodiversity, but to harness the power of our oceans to tackle the most important issue of our time. It's probably the biggest, most ambitious ocean and climate bill this committee's ever considered, and it's not perfect. I appreciate that staff has already made some technical changes to improve concerns that I've raised and address feedback that I've given. I am confident that this bill will continue to improve as it moves forward through the legislative process. And I also believe many of the concerns that have been raised, particularly from the fishing community, can and will be resolved. But we have to find a way to tackle this challenge, and it's so important that today we are getting started. So my question is for Dr. Chris about offshore wind energy. Obviously, it's very important that we pursue renewable energy sources, and we see the opportunities to stimulate the economy and create jobs as well. What kind of economic opportunity do you think offshore wind provides? And what other forms of renewable energy in our oceans do you think we should be exploring? And then I also want to invite you to speak to the way in which you think this legislation supports research and development into those types of energy sources.
Thank you, Representative Huffman, for that question. I'm delighted to answer that. We're very excited about the offshore wind industry that's starting to develop off of our coast in New England and further down the Atlantic coast. Current estimates have the offshore wind industry by 2030 as having generated 83,000 new jobs and 25 billion in annual economic output. So that's a really important resource for our region, and also as other regions look to develop this resource in their waters, shows the potential of what this has to offer. You also mentioned other energy sources, and marine hydrokinetic energy is one of my favorite types of energy. That's energy from the tides, from currents, and waves, as well as OTEC, the energy that's generated from thermal gradients. Anyway, those are boutique energy sources that offer an awful lot of potential for folks on the coast, and they offer the potential to overcome some of the intermittency issues that might happen with other renewable energy sources. Tidal energy can be predicted 100 years out, which is really a kind of remarkable thing. So the resources that are needed to develop those pieces of energy are included in this bill. And already, and I'm looking at Dr. Lubachenko here, Oregon State is one of the marine energy centers, as well as in Florida and also in Hawaii. And so increasing the amount of resources available to continue developing those resources will help us add yet one more tool to the arsenal of clean energy options for energy generated from the ocean going forward.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Chris, I want to try to sneak in one more question. We know the ocean is a busy place, and we've got to carefully site these renewable energy projects, not just to avoid environmental impacts, but to avoid unnecessary impacts on the fishing industry and other users. How do you think this bill supports collaboration and thoughtful planning to avoid those conflicts?
Thank you for that question as well. I think that the New England is representing an opportunity for us to test all of those things and engage stakeholders at the table to overcome some of the challenges associated with the multiple uses and finding that balance. And so I just want to flag for people a resource called the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance that brings scientists, fishermen, and the industry together in the Atlantic region to have those discussions and figure out how to balance the need to develop the energy source, to continue the fisheries, and to make sure that all of those decisions are science-based.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Thank you, Mr. Huffman. And let me now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Stauber has an appointment that he is close to that. Can I ask you if you'd go to him first, please?
Not a problem. Mr. Stauber, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Member Bishop. I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you all for testifying today, Chairman Grijalva. The so-called Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, it fits neatly within the Green New Deal and the goals of the House Democrats. Like other previous bills, this legislation sacrifices affordable energy development done by union men and women under the highest environmental standards in the world. Instead, these types of policies will only increase demand for dirtier energy sources in Russia and other countries that we compete with that lack environmental and labor standards. The average American household spends a little more than $3,500 a year on energy alone. Last year, it reached 60 below zero with the wind chill in my district for several days in a row. And I'm sure that's a little colder than the chairman's district. And as you can imagine, energy costs are something that my neighbors are closely familiar with. I cannot support legislation that will make it harder for families in my district to heat their homes, put food on their table, and further financially burden the middle class because some millionaire on a beach somewhere doesn't want his view of the ocean obscured due to an oil or gas rig. Energy independent is our nation, and energy independence is critical for our nation to continue on. Dr. Hilborn, the goal of this bill is to supposedly mitigate climate change. Could you tell me how increasing the cost of energy for American families, importing energy from abroad, and killing American jobs mitigates climate change?
I'm afraid I really haven't prepared anything on that, and it's really outside my area of expertise.
Okay.
Really fisheries guy.
Dr. Hilborn, what policy should this committee be pursuing to actually benefit marine conservation instead of focusing on hurting American families?
Well, I mean, my expertise is in the fisheries realm, and in fisheries, we do have the issue of the more precautionary we are in the U.S., the more we import fish from places that have lower standards. But we need to become more dynamic and responsive to changes in fish distribution and changes in fish productivity. And we have the system for doing that. The councils can do that. They're just starting to do it on a major basis. But we need to change the assumption that that nature is stable and over time, and realize that things are changing and be able to respond to those changes.
Thank you, Dr. Hilborn. And Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you, Ranking Member Bishop.
Thank you, sir. Let me now recognize Ms. Representative Dingle if she has any questions or she's still with us. If not, let me now turn and recognize Mr. Levin for any questions that he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your leadership on this legislation and for holding today's hearing. Obviously care a great deal about this, representing a district with 52 miles of coastline, and appreciate our witnesses today. Dr. Chris, the bill bans all new offshore leases for oil, gas, or methane hydrate exploration and development. There are some that will tell you that this means we'll be indebted to Russia or others for energy, which frankly is a tired argument with very little basis in fact. Could you explain why we need to ban new offshore drilling leases as soon as possible and move towards onshore renewable energy instead?
Thank you, Congressman Levin, for that question. I'd be happy to answer. Anticipating this question, I looked up, and at the moment we do import 11 million tons, or about 6% of fuel from Russia. We also have achieved a great deal of energy independence in the recent past. Offshore production on the outer continental shelf represents 16 to 18% of the total production in the United States of oil, and only 4% of gas. So if you were to take those two things off, that does not exclude any existing leases that still exist and remain to be produced. The average time for a well production, once the platform is in place, the lifespan could be as many as 25 plus years. So there's plenty of runway. But the real key here, in our perspective, from the aquarium's perspective and from the ocean conservation perspective, is the need to transition as quickly as possible to clean greenhouse gas-free emissions. And that comes in the form of offshore wind, and marine hydrokinetic energy as that gets developed, as well as land-based sources of renewable energy going forward.
Thank you for that. And in your testimony, you say that the New England Aquarium supports offshore wind development, and I quote, with the caveat that the industry use the best available science to inform the siting, construction, and ongoing operation of the platforms. So Dr. Chris, how can science-based approaches to offshore wind siting reduce harm to wildlife and the environment?
Thank you. Again, for the Atlantic, and again, from the aquarium's perspective, one of the primary species that we're concerned about is the North Atlantic right whale. And so we are involved in early studies to understand how those animals are using the habitats where the leases and when the siting of the platforms will be, so that the siting can accommodate those animals as they migrate through and transit through those lease sites. We're looking at fisheries. We're looking at the impacts on sharks and turtles and other vulnerable and threatened species to develop mitigation plans that enable the balance to exist between what is needed for the energy transition of the future, as well as providing for the ecosystem and the wildlife needs of the ocean habitats themselves to ensure that the ocean remains healthy for the future.
Thank you for that. And one more question for you, Doctor. Number of places, including my home state of California, are laying out ambitious plans to transition to 100% of new cars being zero emissions, and also new requirements for trucks, which I believe will have benefits not only for climate action, but also obvious benefits for public health, along with air quality, environmental justice, and the list goes on. I wanted to ask you about ships, and specifically, when can we expect ships to transition to cleaner fuels? And are there additional policies we could add to this bill to help catalyze the zero emission vessel transition in international shipping?
Thank you. That's a really good point. I think in my written testimony, I make the point that right now, shipping in the United States represents 4% of emissions, and that's only expected to grow as international trade grows and our dependence on marine transportation grows. The bill already sets the path and the policy forward for reducing those emissions through fuel efficiency, through the slowdowns of the ship speeds. And then those have the co-benefits that I mentioned for marine mammals. And so leaning on programs in your home state that have been so successful, like the Blue Skies, Blue Whales initiative, I think is a really great start for reducing shipping emissions in U.S. waters.
I'm out of time, but I want to thank you for all your great work, Doctor, and I thank my colleagues for their great work on this bill. And I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you. Appreciate it, sir. Dr. Hilborn, let me ask you a question. Ms. Lubachenko's testimony made a rather alarmist claim that, if I quote this right, even the best fishery management cannot substitute for effective, high protective MPAs in terms of protecting biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. Your testimony, Mr. Hilborn, actually takes a different approach. Can you just explain to the committee how our current system is, in your mind, a better approach?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for this question. Well, the current system protects biodiversity over 100% of the economic zone of the U.S. through the councils. That is, I serve on the SSC of the Western Pacific Council, and it is our job to meet U.S. legislation like the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, over the entire economic zone. Proposed 30 by 30 closures would simply protect 30% of the zone, whereas using the existing tools of bycatch avoidance, protecting vulnerable ecosystems, protecting target species, we can protect 100% of the economic zone and the biodiversity in 100% of the economic zone. And certainly the track record with respect to target species is outstanding.
Thank you. Let me give you another question, if I could, sir. Both Ms. Lubachenko and Ms. Chris quote a recent study that says if you protect an additional 5% of the ocean, you can increase future catch by at least 20%. Now, considering we only pass laws that have jurisdiction over the United States, are these claims really relevant?
Well, I mean, certainly there are places in the world where marine protected areas would increase catch. And the biggest potential is South and Southeast Asia that has very ineffective fisheries management. Overfishing is rampant. But there's really no potential to increase the yield of American fisheries in the U.S. economic zone by marine protected areas.
So if, as I think Ms. Chris in her written testimony said, that wind power disturbs fishery efforts, but it's worth the cost. This may be out of your area of expertise, so I'll just ask you this. What do you say would be the effect on fishing in the United States, the industry as a whole, if certain areas are put off limits and then certain areas which do have these type of good kinds of energy developments are also going to be included in the areas that are on limits and still have an impact that's negative, even if it's worth the cost? And once again, maybe I'm asking you something that is out of your area of expertise and it's an unfair question.
Well, I don't think there's a general answer to that. That it would all depend on where these things were sited and how much catch is coming from those places, how mobile the species are, whether they would effectively be caught elsewhere. So I just don't think that there is an answer to that. It'd have to be done on a case-by-case basis.
All right, thank you. I know that's well. Like Ms. Grab, I don't have a site here. Do I have time for one question of Ms. Lubachenko? 1 minute, I'm told. Okay. And Ms. Lubachenko, you made suggestions that state management of their jurisdictions are not as efficient and effective as the federal government would be. And so there's an implication that we should federalize management areas. I just want to know if those comments are aimed at simply the offshore fishing, or are you talking about fishery management that's onshore? Because there is a very clear evidence, especially on onshore fish managements that don't come under NOAA, that there is incompetence on the federal government that far exceeds what the states are able to do in their fish hatcheries. So is that a statement that's only dealing with ocean issues and ocean fishing, or are you talking about all fishing?
Ranking Member Bishop, thanks for the opportunity to clarify this. I am not in any way, shape, or form suggesting federalizing the management of all fisheries. States are responsible for managing the fisheries in their state waters, except where there are agreements where the stocks go back and forth. My point was simply that
okay, but before you run out of time, we're simply talking about, you were talking about all fisheries. We're dealing with also only those issues that deal with offshore ocean fishing. Is that correct?
My point is simply that state-managed fisheries are not managed generally as well as our federally managed fisheries, and we need to do a better job to help the states do their management better.
Well, okay. And if you're talking about all fisheries, then I think there's clear evidence that that's not an accurate statement. And I think many of those local fisheries on the coast would have some quibbling with your jurisdictional approach as well. But if you're talking about all fishery matches, especially those that are onshore and not offshore, especially those hatcheries, that clearly is not the case. Mismanagement is worse with the federal government on all fisheries. That's why I wanted to clarify if you were talking about all fisheries. So I appreciate you stating that fact.
Certainly some state fisheries are well managed. My point is they all need to be, and they aren't. There's much room for progress in state managed fisheries.
Well, and obviously state management gives you a greater opportunity of having success than if you have a federal government management system that takes everything as a one size fits all and then doesn't meet the needs of those total local areas, which I have seen, once again, that's why I wanted to make the distinction. I have seen that clearly in onshore fish management regulations and jurisdictions. So I appreciate you clarifying that. Mr. Grijalva, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me recognize now Representative Holland, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 3 scientific papers that support Title II and a letter submitted by 180 organizations and businesses demonstrating broad support for the goal to protect 30% of our oceans and lands by 2030, as set forth in Title II of the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act. Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Lubachenko, I'd like to give you the opportunity, if you would like to take it, to respond any further to Mr. Hilborn on his last.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I appreciate that opportunity. Both the question and the response framed fishery management against conservation, as if we have an either-or choice. And in my view, we absolutely need good fishery management, and we absolutely need good conservation. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is the law that regulates federally managed fisheries, is a fishery management act. It is not a conservation act. It does not manage biodiversity. It is, and so suggesting that it is a good tool for managing biodiversity is simply inaccurate. We need better tools to achieve biodiversity conservation that are a complement to the Magnuson-Stevens Act. The opportunity exists to expand our protection and management of biodiversity with all the other benefits that MPAs bring, in parallel to continuing good fishery management. And in particular, much of Dr. Hilborn's statements are focusing on the fact that our federally managed fisheries do a good job with target species, which for the most part they do, but they have not had as strong a track record with weak stocks and with many of the bycatch species. In both of those instances, spatial protection through fully or highly protected MPAs can in fact be a very nice complement. So this is not either or, we need both.
Thank you, Dr. Lubachenko. And Dr. Leonard, How does the bill maintain or accelerate the much needed intergovernmental coordination for ocean justice, in your opinion?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. Well, in particular, the bill has a section to support the regional ocean partnerships, which are kind of the new evolution of what I previously talked about in terms of the regional planning bodies that came out of the national ocean policy in prior administrations. With the regional ocean partnerships, that's where we see the intergovernmental coordination happening on the ground right now. In my specific instance, with the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, through Marco, NROC, the West Coast Pacific states, as well as tribes, working together to think through what does ocean planning look like in our regions, how do we sustainably use ocean resources, and coordinate all of our ocean activities with one another. The one thing that I will point out in the way the current portions of the bill read that I would say that we need some additional review and modernizing is around tribes. Right now, the regional ocean partnerships are structured to give states power and allow for states and federal agencies to have greater intergovernmental coordination. But there's nothing that really allows for there to be supportive funding and infrastructure for tribes amongst ourselves to have that intertribal coordination as it pertains to ocean conservation and ocean resiliency. So I think we almost need something that's a blend of what's stated in terms of regional ocean partnerships and what we previously had with the regional planning bodies, where there was a mandated intergovernmental coordination of equal parity of tribes, states, and federal representatives coming together on an equal footing. And I just don't really see that playing out right now in the regional ocean partnership as it currently stands.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Chris, I just have a few seconds. How do we convince those in landlocked states that the ocean does in fact impact them and their representatives should support ocean climate policy?
Thank you. I'll answer that as quickly as possible. The ocean controls all of the weather patterns that we see across the United States and across all of the continents. And so the rain that's happening in the middle of the country, the droughts that are happening in Colorado, New Mexico, the wildfires, all of these things are ultimately tied to the interconnected nature of our entire planet. And those patterns are driven by the ocean. So we all have an investment to make in a healthy ocean.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I yield.
Gentlelady yields, and let me now turn and recognize Mr. Gomer. Sir, time is yours. Let me then turn to Mr. Westerman. Sir, you're recognized. We turn to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. A number of things to counter. First, I want to briefly respond to my friend from California who made the comments on saying there was no relationship between stopping domestic energy production and increased importation. I'd be willing to make a bet or a wager with my friend right now that I can produce evidence showing that is exactly the case in history. We've had expert witnesses before this very committee that have testified that, including during the Obama administration. In fact, during the moratorium or permatorium in the aftermath of Deepwater Horizon, that's exactly what we saw. And if my friend can produce some evidence or facts showing otherwise, then I would I would be willing to yield you my future time on the committee. But the reality is that data doesn't exist. In any case, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record House Concurrent Resolution number 38 that was passed by the Louisiana legislature, including unanimously passed by the Louisiana Senate, that is in total opposition to the underlying bill, the Blue Ocean legislation. Mr. Chairman, look, this whole thing, I mean, this bill is written and referred to 5 different committees. We know that that's not going to go anywhere because we're not going to get through 5 different committees. I certainly share my friend's objectives of having a cleaner energy future and reducing emissions. My home state of Louisiana, if any state is affected by sea rise and the symptoms of climate change, it's the people that I represent. And so we have a great stake in ensuring that we have sustainable coastal communities, that we have clean energy future, that we have sustainable, affordable energy policies. But this legislation really doesn't even do that. And I think we all know that. For example, if this legislation were implemented years ago, we would have lost $200 billion. That's with a B, $200 billion to the United States Treasury. I ask any of my friends on the other side, how would you fund senior citizen programs, healthcare programs, education programs, environmental programs, transportation programs? How would you do that without $200 billion? There's this concept out there, there's this belief out there, Mr. Chairman, from many folks on the other side that the target or the enemy is the energy source. That's not it. And we've got to stop saying that and stop believing it, because it's going to prevent us from actually implementing suggestions or policies that actually make sense. It is the emissions, and there are proven strategies today, technologies today, where you can actually sequester emissions, you can utilize emissions, CCS, CCU type technologies that complement our conventional energy sources. Look, we all know we can sit here and ban cars in California and everywhere else for next year. You don't have the energy infrastructure in place to supplant the energy that is brought to the table with 30 times more energy density than the next closest alternative. That's what conventional fuels provide. So we've got to stop this dream world that some people are operating in. I want to ask perhaps the sponsor of the bill one question. One question. As you know, this bill will stop the investment of revenues into wetlands restoration in the coast of Louisiana, which is the greatest wetlands loss in the continental United States. And it will stop investment in hurricane protection and coastal resiliency programs. I mentioned in our last hearing, this year alone, we had Hurricane Laura and Marco that came at the same time. We had Hurricane Delta and Zeta, and then caught the edge of Hurricane Sally. We had people die. What would you say to the family members of people in Louisiana that lost loved ones when your legislation would actually take future investments in the restoration of our coast and the protection of these communities?
Going forward, we can deal with this question, or we can continue to avoid it as we have in the past, dealing with climate change and the important role of oceans in the mitigation and resiliency that has to be built up. But the legislation is.
I'm happy to have that.
The legislation does not intend to do any restoration.
I've tried to have this conversation with my friend many, many times in the past. And look, here's the reality. All you people sitting there on your pedestals and telling us what we need to do, we produce more offshore energy than every other state in the nation combined. We have the top commercial fisheries in the continental United States in the same exact area. All these people are coming to try and prescribe solutions for us that have no idea what in the world they're talking about, what the on-ground conditions are. And the people that actually represent these areas, they're opposed. They're opposed. The people that actually represent these very communities that understand this stuff much better than any of you and your little towers out there around the United States that don't even represent, don't even live, don't even spend time in these very areas. It's really embarrassing to continue to see legislation like this that is so offensive to the people that I represent and simply doesn't respect the science or on the ground conditions and offends those that repeatedly have lost loved ones as a result of the inaction by this very committee. I yield back.
I couldn't agree with you more, sir. And our exploration of constituents, perhaps even within your district and other districts in Louisiana, considering the cancer corridor, and the environmental justice and frontline and communities across portions of Louisiana need to be dealt with. There is life and death issues there as well, and I hope you join with us in working on that. With that, let me now recognize Ms. Dingle, if she is available now for her time. Ms. Dingle? Mr. Cartwright, if he is available to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, late Monday morning, Hurricane Iota became the latest in-season hurricane in recorded history to reach Category 5 intensity in the Atlantic Basin. As this dangerous hurricane makes landfall in Central America and Nicaragua, we are again reminded of the disastrous effects of climate change. The scientific community agrees that a healthy ocean is going to help us fight the climate crisis. Now, as Vice Chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science, I, along with my Democratic colleagues, have fought for robust funding for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, an agency designed to protect and restore our coastal regions. I've also introduced two bills, the PREPARE Act and the SAFE Act, which improve adaptation and resiliency to extreme weather events and climate change. That is why I applaud our chairman, Chairman Grijalva, for introducing H.R. 8632, the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, the bill that would provide the resources we need to protect our ocean and coastal communities. The investments we make now will save us significant hardship and expense in the future. As we rebuild our communities after each natural disaster, we've quickly learned the lesson that the costs of inaction on climate change are incredibly high. A recent study in Scientific Reports states that not acting right now to mitigate climate change will result in a projected additional $600 billion every year in damage. Given all of this, I would like to ask Dr. Chris, if you could elaborate on what you think the long-term fiscal and real-world impacts of the investments called for in the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act would be.
Thank you, Congressman Cartwright, for that question. We firmly believe that these investments will be not only good for the ocean, but good for Americans and for the economy. In a recent example, in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, $160 million to NOAA was afforded to NOAA that supported 125 habitat restoration projects. Those projects have paid a great deal of dividends over the following years, not only in jobs, they created a little over 2,200 jobs. They restored 25,000 acres of habitat and have generated $260 million in economic output annually. Natural infrastructure is known to be more cost effective than gray or hard infrastructure. And it has the co-benefits of not just providing resilience, but the ability to store carbon, to support nurseries of fisheries, and in our own Boston Harbor, sharks, which is a really delightful development since Boston Harbor has been cleaned up. So I think that there's so many benefits to these types of investments, and they've been shown time and time again to pay dividends on more than the initial investment.
Thank you, Dr. Chris. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the climate crisis not only impacts our environment, our economy, and our health, but it also harms our oceans. Current laws, like the Magnuson-Stevens Act, only manage 0.2% of the ocean's known species. With 1 in 6 species at risk of extinction, this hands-off approach is terribly inadequate to address the existential risk to our oceans posed by climate change. The Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act addresses the dangerous consequences of the climate crisis by holistically protecting the ocean's biodiversity and natural resources. Now, Dr. Chris, Dr. Leonard, Dr. Lubachenko, can you elaborate on why protections outlined in this bill are critical for the health of our oceans?
I'll jump off and just say that the protections afforded through marine protected areas go beyond fisheries, and they, through increased biodiversity within the boundaries of a marine protected area, impart resilience to things like ocean acidification. And those types of studies have been done in places where if you have the entire range of all the way up through apex predators, that those systems have been shown to withstand changes in temperature and pH that we are unable to control. So as we can control things like setting aside special places that give those places resilience, that just benefits the entire ocean as a whole.
Dr. Leonard?
Yes, thank you. I would say that the bill really supports the mitigation efforts that we would need right now to address the climate crisis within ocean conservation and ocean ecosystems. So what does that actually look like in practice? That's research going to oyster habitats and oyster hatcheries and thinking about the way in which we can use oysters to rehabilitate ecosystems grounded in indigenous knowledge systems, which is something that we've been doing in this part of the world for thousands of years. And then in addition, other mitigation efforts like nature-based solutions, again, grounded in indigenous knowledge systems. At Shinnecock, we have done some great coastal habitat restoration through seagrass planting. And I think we need to have more of those mitigation efforts. And this bill provides the funding to be able to do those types of exact conservation measures.
And Dr. Lubachenko.
Thank you, Congressman Cartwright. I really appreciate the fact that you've painted a picture of the vast biodiversity that is not really under fishery management. And let me bring that home to US waters because the numbers that you cited were global. The Magnuson Fisheries Act manages around 474 stocks or stocks and stock complexes. But there are nearly 50,000 documented species in US waters. And so the Magnuson-Stevens Act actually manages less than 1% of all known species in US waters. So again, I would repeat that the Magnuson-Stevens fishery management is a fishery management law. It's not an ocean management law. And so managing oceans more holistically, where we have vibrant fisheries as well as 30% in fully to highly protected areas is really essential to achieve the kind of benefits that Dr. Chris was alluding to. Safe havens for wildlife, enhanced resilience to climate change, to help recover weak stocks, to contribute to food security where fisheries are not well managed, and that's mostly elsewhere in the world. But they also provide reference areas where we can evaluate the impacts of fisheries for areas, so to compare inside and outside of MPAs. And we've recently discovered that there are vast stocks of carbon on the seabed, and using protected areas to protect those stores of carbon can prevent them being released into the atmosphere. And so marine protected areas here are really a powerful but underutilized tool that will bring not only biodiversity benefit, but climate resilience and many other benefits to a healthy ocean that we all need.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, sorry for going over. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Westerman, sir, you're recognized. Mr. Westerman? Let me now recognize then Mr. McClintock, sir. All right, let me now turn to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto. You have 5 minutes, sir. You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We just had an election. Climate change was on the ballot, and President-elect Joe Biden won. A majority of Americans, especially our young people, want significant change. My colleagues across the aisle should take note. We once again have a national mandate for the U.S. to combat climate change at home. And as the most advanced nation on the planet, we have a duty to lead the world effort. Climate change denial and the fact that it is caused by human activity is once again an extremist political position. It's a dangerous view that threatens the future of our nation and our planet. Scientists, federal agencies, the US military, even the Federal Reserve and SEC are starting to recognize the long-term risks. And the American people want us to stop bickering and work together on bipartisan solutions. The facts. The largest energy bill of the term was bipartisan. The Clean Economy, Jobs, and Innovation Act, where 213 Democrats and 7 Republicans voted yes. It revised the Department of Energy grants relating to energy storage, microgrids, including renewables, nuclear, and yes, natural gas. It moved the ball forward on combating climate change in a reasonable and incremental fashion. But here's what I find so interesting about that vote. The rest of you voted no, other than 7 Republicans. You voted no along with the very Green New Deal proponents you attack here today. The path forward is clear. We need to come together to pass bipartisan bills and to continue to act on climate. The oceans are part of that solution, and we've seen many bills dealing with that here today. In my own home state, Florida's coasts remain in danger of offshore oil drilling, and our great Florida reef is in danger of massive coral bleaching from warming seas. We must protect these environmental treasures for all Americans, and my fellow Floridians, Congressman Christ and Congresswoman Debbie Merkels-Powell have presented important reforms here today. Ms. Leonard, looking at Representative Chris' bill to designate regional ocean partnerships of the national, of NOAA and for other purposes, you talked about it at length already. How are communities of color left behind? How are poorer communities left behind without these regional ocean partnerships?
Well, I think, put blankly, it's the lack of coordination means that communities are going to be left behind. And so the regional ocean partnerships create a forum by which states, federal representatives, tribal representatives, fishery management council representatives, as well as our broader stakeholders actually have forums and entities that they can come to share concerns. And, you know, we also on the ground have been doing a lot of work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice to think about how do we make sure that there is ocean justice for all. And I think, you know, one pathway is supporting innovative bills like the Ocean-Based Solutions Act to do just that, and to continue to support our work through regional ocean partnerships. To do great work and to have best available science means that we need funding to support that research and to support the data collection. And that then in turn allows us to support justice movements that benefit local communities, communities of color, and marginalized communities, both based on economic impacts as well. So I think that that's why this is needed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left? I can't see it on the screen.
I think your time, about 45 seconds.
Okay, with Dr. Lubachenko, Debbie Merkels-Powell has a bill
I don't have the clock up here.
to establish a grant program to benefit coastal habitats, shovel-ready restoration coastlines and fisheries act. How would this be important in really moving ahead some of these projects?
Congressman Soto, it's extremely important that we pay close attention to these coastal habitats, especially the seagrass beds, mangroves, salt marshes that are what we call the blue carbon ecosystems. They just suck up carbon much, much faster than do forests on land. And protecting them is one of the first lines of defense so that we don't lose them. We don't release all of the carbon that has been stored there for millennia into the atmosphere. But we also have learned that it's possible to protect them, to restore them after they have been degraded. And up the coast from you, not your state, but up the coast in Virginia, and I note in my written testimony, there's a very nice example of restoration of seagrass beds in Virginia recently that has shown the power of being able to utilize these coastal ecosystems to reduce carbon emissions and help directly, significantly with mitigating climate change. Because those habitats also provide a wealth of other benefits, They restore nursery areas. They provide recreational opportunities. They are buffers against storm surge. They're critically important in multiple dimensions. And having the resources to do that coastal restoration is critically important. And as Dr. Chris mentioned, when I was administrator of NOAA, the ARA funds that we utilized to do habitat restoration, we had only $160 million. And as it turned out, we got $3 billion worth of proposals from communities around the country. So there's huge latent opportunity and interest in
I'm going to need you to close. I'm going to need you to wrap up your answer. So
apologies.
Quite a bit. No problem. Let me turn the wheels. Thank you. On my Republican colleagues' side of the dais, is there anyone, we don't have a name at this point, that wishes to ask questions of the...
Yes, sir.
Oh, yes, Ms. Gonzalez, you are recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield my 5 minutes to my friend Gary Graves.
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to show you a graphic here, and I ask unanimous consent that this be included in the record. This is a graphic that shows crude oil supply sources to California refineries. As you can see here, Mr. Chairman, as energy production in California has gone down, as they have reduced the energy coming in from Alaska, all of that has been supplanted or replaced by energy from foreign sources. And Mr. Chairman, you can see that's not a reduction. It's not a reduction in oil, none. It's simply replacing or supplanting all of that domestic production with foreign. Mr. Chairman, I can't vouch for the source of this information, but I can tell you it's from energy.ca.gov. Ouch. Mr. Chairman, look, just bringing more fact into this thing. Look, the reality is, as you all know, y'all are scientists panel, you're our expert panel, our witnesses, you're scientists. This is a global issue. For every 1 ton of emissions we have reduced in the United States, 4 additional tons of emissions have come out of China. That's not a global reduction, it's a global increase. The Paris Accords result in a global increase. This whole thing, we're not even bringing science to the table. I'm asking for more science, not less, more science to inform our decisions moving forward. The facts clearly show when you reduce domestic production, you increase your dependence upon foreign sources of energy. Facts and science and history shows you have greater emissions from foreign sources of energy than you have from domestic. So look, we can sit here and do all this pretty window dressing. We can talk about this in a way that makes us all feel really good. None of this is based on science. None of this is based upon fact. And it's incredibly frustrating to watch people wander down this emotional path without any type of scientific support. And Dr. Lubachenko, you and I have worked together before extensively. And you made a comment, and I want to push back on it. You made the comment about state-managed fisheries. Dr. Lubachenko, look, I'll give you one quick fact. The fact is that I can't think of, and I'm fairly certain on this, there is not a single state-managed fishery that has required a restoration plan or rebuilding plan. Yet, I can sit here and think of a whole lot of federal managed fisheries that have been overfished that require it. So I don't think it's fair to take shots at state managed fisheries. In fact, my home state of Louisiana, we developed the LA Creel system, which has a 90% certainty level, whereas the NRIP program is 80% or less. And so, you know, we have better science and better data informing our fish management than what the federal government does. And so I don't think comments like that are necessarily accurate or fair. And I do want to give you a chance to respond in case I misconstrued something that you said.
Congressman Graves, it's great to see you again. Thank you, sir, for your comment. I did not intend at all to throw state fisheries under the bus, to criticize them. I'm simply pointing out that we need effective state-managed fisheries, just like we need effective federally managed fisheries. Some state fisheries are well managed, others are absolutely not. And most of them, we simply don't have enough information to know how they are doing. Most states simply don't have the resources to do the kind of effective fishery management that's really needed. Thanks
And
for the opportunity
we've
to
imposed
clarify that.
additional fees on ourselves to make sure that we had the resources that were needed to properly manage our fisheries in Louisiana. So we did that to ourselves to make sure that the resources were there.
And that's a great model.
Chairman, I'm sorry?
And that's a great model.
Thank you. And so, Mr. Chairman, look, I'll say this again, and I'll offer this to you every day of the week. In regard to a cleaner energy future, reducing emissions, the United States continuing to be the global energy technology leader, I'm 100% in. I'd be happy to work with you any day of the week, but continuing to throw out legislation that has no chance of going anywhere, and quite frankly, is only going to result in higher energy prices, higher emissions, and creating more jobs in other countries. I don't think that's a solution for America. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. And Mr. Lowenthal, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a written statement from the World Shipping Council on the Ocean-Based Climate Solution Act, HR 8632.
So ordered without objection.
Thank you. And I also want to thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the staff for working so hard, and the other members that have contributed to this and the discussion that we're having today. And I truly appreciate also listening to Representative Graves talking about that we're not focusing enough on emissions, where we tend to focus more on the source rather than emissions. I will say in California, we have tried to address that question by being relatively neutral on what are the solutions and more focusing on emissions reduction. And I think it's always important for us to look at the concept, and I appreciate your raising that issue. I want to talk first to some of the things that have been on here, if I can open up my questions. I've got it. I want to talk to first Dr. Crick. Dr. Crick, first of all, I want to thank you and the New England Aquarium for your great work. You've worked with my staff, especially Shane Trimmer, on many questions around over the years on aquaculture, on marine mammal protection. You've helped us as we have worked on marine debris, especially plastic and the reduction of plastic pollution. And I look forward to working with you and the aquarium on these important issues because they're not going away. They're going to. But I want to talk about one thing that you talked about and that I have direct experience with, and that was the legislation that we're talking about today really addresses and establishes the Quiet Seas and the Clean Skies Vessel Speed Reduction Award Program. The ports, I represent the Port of Long Beach, and my adjacent port is the Port of LA, and we are the busiest commercial maritime hub for in terms of much of international trade and international cargo. And our shipping lanes cross the Santa Barbara Channel, which is a vital marine ecosystem where whales congregate to feed. We had established a program from the Santa Barbara Channel down to the ports of LA Long Beach, a voluntary program called the Blue Whales, Blue Skies program that you talked about, which is attempted to both accommodate commerce and also to protect marine mammals in the Santa Barbara Channel. And given all the work that you have done in the New England Aquarium to protect the North American right whale, I'm really interested in the data that you have about the threats that marine mammals face, especially around ship strikes, which is what we tried to deal with. And you've already talked a little bit about it. And I'm kind of interested, do you think a voluntary program that encourages the reduction of ship speeds is going to help marine mammals and it's going to promote ecosystem resilience? In the program in the quiet seas and clear skies vessel, there's both a voluntary program and also in other parts near maritime maritime conservancies, we have a more mandatory program. I'm interested in, how do you see the voluntary program working?
Thank you, Congressman Lowenthal, for that question. As I mentioned in my oral testimony and my written, we would like to see a mandatory ship restriction specifically for North Atlantic right whales. That said, this bill and the provisions that it outlines for shipping and the voluntary measures and the rewards-based system, we think will help. That is not something that has been implemented in the Atlantic. And to demonstrate to answer your question about the impacts of shipping specifically on the North Atlantic right whale is, as I mentioned, we lost 2 North Atlantic right whales of the remaining 366 this year, both juveniles, to vessel strikes. And they weren't ships, they were small vessels, maybe 25 feet, going faster than 10 knots. The science that we have done at the aquarium demonstrates that we can reduce mortality to North Atlantic right whales by upwards of 90% by reducing ship speeds to 10 knots or less. We've also been very successful in using science to recommend shifts in shipping lanes to avoid the most concentrated areas where these animals are congregating to feed. So I think the time is up, but I'm happy to explore this more with you.
Thank you. Do I have time? I don't see the
Much
clock.
time. I don't have my clock up right now.
I don't either. So I'm going to ask one more question. You just have to cut me off.
Okay.
And I'll be quick to Dr. Lubachenko. We've heard a lot today about offshore wind, but everything has been focused on the North Atlantic and the Atlantic. And I'm interested in it, even though we're talking about this on a national level, what research and development is going to be needed to overcome hurdles, can they? Is this something, a technology, offshore wind, that can be expanded into the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific? And what are we going to do? What types of research and development is needed to make it more cost effective? Because we're not seeing it in those areas like we are in the North Atlantic.
Yep. Congressman Lowenthal, thanks. I think the evidence shows that there are likely to be different types of ocean energy that are going to be appropriate for different places around the country. In some places it's going to be wind, but in others tidal or current, or in some cases wave energy. And the R&D that is required to really determine what's most appropriate, how continuous the energy provision would be, what kind of infrastructure is needed. Much of that is in the very elementary stages. And so investments in R&D that can, and research, in the research that enables us to understand what works best in this place and how it connects to grids on land is absolutely needed and would be a very smart path forward.
Just before I yield back, I would like to follow up that conversation with you as we begin to talk about a comprehensive approach. We've really only focused so far on offshore wind and turbines. And you're saying if we're going to look at other parts of the country, it would be appropriate to do research and development and to really look at the opportunities to create energy in other ways than just through wind. And I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you. Again, let me, not seeing any names on the minority side, unless there's one that would that isn't on my list or hasn't been provided to me? If not, let me now recognize Ms. Barragan for your 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chair Grijalva, for holding this important hearing on ocean solutions to the climate crisis. Climate change is impacting everyone, especially our most vulnerable coastal communities. However, there's an opportunity to build a sustainable ocean economy that creates new industries and jobs while reducing greenhouse gas pollution. We are leading the way at the Port of Los Angeles, where I happen to represent, where a new public-private ocean institute called AltaSea is creating a world-class ocean-based 35-acre campus where scientists, entrepreneurs, and educators can come up with innovative solutions to food, energy, and climate security. It's estimated that in Los Angeles, the ocean-based economy will produce more than 126,000 jobs, paying a combined $37.7 billion in wages by 2023. The bills the committee is hearing today will drive climate solutions, restore our oceans, foster innovation, and help us realize the potential of a sustainable ocean economy. Dr. Lubachenko, an important part of the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act is the permanent protection of the outer continental shelf from offshore drilling. Prior to this pandemic, fishing, tourism, and recreation along the Pacific, Atlantic, and Florida's Gulf Coast supported over 2.5 million jobs. 10 years ago, you led NOAA's response to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill off the coast of Louisiana. Can you speak to the potential dangers and impacts of an oil spill in the outer continental shelf that make permanent protection from drilling so important?
Thanks, Congresswoman. We've seen in no uncertain terms the devastation that massive oil spills can have, but even smaller spills can have really nasty impacts on ecosystems, not only on the most obvious target species like oiled birds, for whose images they're very graphic, but also for the other species below the surface, whether it's marine mammals that get oiled or very, very small microscopic species in the plankton that then get incorporated into the rest of the ecosystem. You know, the bottom line is that oil is really toxic. The hydrocarbons that are in the oil are really nasty to living creatures. And we, starting with the Santa Barbara oil spill just up the coast from you in 1969, we've seen how devastating oil spills can be. And so doing everything possible to avoid those spills is really smart. When we add to that consideration the consequences of burning that oil and the contributions it makes to climate change and all the devastating impacts that has on the ocean and on people, it seems a no-brainer that we shift as rapidly as possible to green energy sources, and to do so in ways that are innovative and that really create jobs. I love what is happening in the ports of LA, the ports in Congressman Lowenthal's district. Those ports are doing really innovative, great work that is conservation and smart business in ways that I think are a wonderful model.
Great. Well, thank you. Representative Lowenthal has Long Beach, and I have Los Angeles, and together we partner together, and it's a great way to have a duo team. Dr. Leonard, thank you for your incredible work as a tribal leader on the Mid-Atlantic Regional Planning Body of the U.S. National Ocean Council. How should Congress ensure our ocean climate policy addresses the needs of environmental justice communities and builds trust between government and these communities?
Well, I think one step forward is the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, you know, and the provisions within the bill that allow for increased funding, increased research, increased data collection. But in doing all of that, it also needs to support tribal sovereignty and support the federal trust responsibility in ensuring that tribes in a government-to-government relationship are a part of that research, are a part of the data collection, are integral partners in how the United States envisions ocean conservation and ocean justice moving forward. And one issue that is of particular importance and of particular severity for myself being a Shinnecock woman is relocation. And I think provisions of the bill that provide for communities, coastal communities, to relocate are much needed, and we actually even need more. One thing that I see in the bill right now, and that doesn't exist for tribal nations, are legislative guarantees. So the bill allows for funding for relocation, which is very much needed and an unmet need currently for tribal communities and coastal communities broadly. But what we need as well are legislative guarantees that as our people are forced to relocate due to the climate crisis, that our tribal nations, that our land status will transfer with our people as we're forced to relocate to new lands of cultural patrimony. And I don't see that currently in the provisions, but I'm hopeful that a bill like this could envision that and could chart a path forward so that relocation, which is real, we have environmental climate refugees currently in the United States, can have more pathways for funding that can support that relocation and support the overall health of American citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield.
Lady yields, and let me now, absent any indication from the minority side, if they have someone that wants to address the panelists, let me now ask gentleman from Chicago, Mr. Garcia. The time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking members, and to the witnesses joining us today. Today, we speak on the existential threat of global climate change and the devastating impacts on wildlife and our communities, impacts that will affect generations to come. Although Chicago is far from the ocean, we're no strangers to the impacts of climate change. Climate change is causing significant and far-reaching impacts on the Great Lakes. Unchecked human activity over the last 2 centuries has led to habitat losses, invasive species outbreaks, and polluted air, water, and sediments. The Great Lakes, one of the world's most abundant freshwater resources, hold more than 90% of North America's fresh surface water. Unless we take action, it will suffer from severe pollution, hurting the 34 million people who live within its basin, and especially communities of color. Dr. Leonard, thank you for joining us today. In your testimony, you mentioned that, quote, data collection and monitoring of the Great Lakes ocean, bays, estuaries, and coast must be done in consultation with tribal nations. 2 questions. Why is it so important to consult with tribal nations and other communities traditionally left out of the policy-making process? And 2, Section 1505 of the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act authorizes a study to assess public access to the nation's coast, including the Great Lakes. What barriers to accessing our coast do some communities face?
Thank you very much for those questions. And I would say for the first question, to be informed decision makers related to marine environments, our Great Lakes, as well as ocean environments, we have to have the best available science. And right now we don't, because we're not including indigenous science and data collection within indigenous communities in the data that informs our best available science that then informs our decision makers. So what we're looking for in the Great Lakes region as well, because we are dealing in an international region of both Canada, the United States, provinces, First Nations, tribal nations, Métis communities, a really complex space. We need data collection that allows for, again, intergovernmental coordination and for the ability for tribes to, and in other indigenous communities, to be able to contribute our data to the best available science that's informing decision-making in the basin. And one way that we see that sort of having a disconnect right now is some of the best science coming out about Great Lakes habitat restoration, protection against aquatic invasive species is coming from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And they're bootstrapping their budget because they don't have funding streams available to them to really have that influx that they need to do the research and continue the great science work that they're doing, and then to have that contribute to the larger national best available science conversation. So that's one area. We need more Indigenous involvement in data collection and science because it should inform our best available science for decision making. And your second question about access of communities to our oceans, we have a legacy and a history of segregation across America. Those segregation policies and laws have had a systemic influence on the way in which communities of color, disenfranchised economic communities, are able to access our oceans and coastlines. There have been some great studies coming out about even just the cost of a parking permit to access a beach. You know, our beaches and our coastlines are not really in the public domain, and they have been disenfranchised from communities of color and communities who are economically deprived because of the way in which we've set up systemic laws and segregation policies that have purposely aimed at excluding those communities for decades, if not centuries. And so we have to do a lot more to remedy those historic injustices if we are going to chart a path of ocean reconciliation and ocean justice for our future.
Thank you, Dr. Leonard. Dr. Lubachenko, in my last half a minute plus, the living shorelines provision in this bill sets aside funds for the Great Lakes. Can you please explain what living shorelines are and how they specifically benefit the Great Lakes?
Sure, Congressman. Thank you so much for that question. Living shorelines are simply shorelines that have vegetation and creatures that live there. And those dune systems, grass systems, etc., are providing very important functions to stabilize shorelines, to absorb carbon dioxide, to help provide critical nursery areas for important fisheries. And so the vegetation that is along the shoreline is critically important to the healthy adjacent waters of the Great Lakes. They interact in very complex fashion. And so having them be intact, having them be healthy, contributes both to the livelihoods of people in the vicinity, but also to the resilience to climate change. Ways to restore them are important so both protecting and restoring them are important.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I applaud you for introducing this landmark Oceans Solutions Bill to tackle the climate crisis and for including critical provisions that would benefit the Great Lakes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia. Let me now, absent any indication from the minority side, Mr. Tonko, you are recognized, sir.
Hey, thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for organizing this hearing. Very thoughtful and very timely. And thank you to each and every witness for the invaluable testimony you've provided. Oceans are unmistakably critically important in the fight against climate change. And so I appreciate the opportunity today. So Dr. Lubachenko, over the past 15 years, and particularly in the Trump administration, climate scientists have often been targeted for producing work that has been viewed as politically inconvenient to those who deny the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. Such attacks have been visible in the last 4 years as federal scientists have been silenced and sidelined, keeping them from sharing their work with the public and informing our national response. My question is, how do strong scientific integrity protections at agencies working on climate science serve to benefit the public good?
Congressman Tonko, it's nice to see you again, and thank you for being such a strong and effective champion for scientific integrity. The importance of scientific integrity is paramount. People need to trust the information that is provided by the federal government. The most obvious example are weather forecasts and disaster warnings. If people think that they have been manipulated for political reasons, then they won't take them seriously and they won't take the actions that are needed to protect their lives, their families, their property. The same is true for fisheries information or any other kinds of information that the federal government is providing to people. We need to trust that that information is based on the best available science and has not been cherry picked or manipulated, or in some cases, the science is distorted. The scientific integrity policies that agencies created under President Obama, my agency, NOAA included, are intended to ensure that the information is not cherry-picked, manipulated, distorted. And that's important not only for public trust, but it is also important so that the agencies can have the best possible scientists working for the government. Scientists are not going to work in a government where their science is ignored or altered or suppressed. They will leave, and new scientists aren't going to come and take their places if they think that their science is unwelcome. And so to have a thriving scientific enterprise in agencies, we need to have scientific integrity, and the public needs to be able to trust what the government says. And for both of those reasons, not only do agencies need to have good, strong scientific integrity policies, but it's important that there be a public expression of the importance of that as well through legislation that says, this is our expectation. This is what we want of federal science.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And what recommendations would you make to our President-elect Biden to strengthen scientific integrity policies across the gamut of federal government?
Congressman, we've seen from some of the violations of scientific integrity policies, for example, at NOAA that happened in the last few years, that there are multiple ways that the scientific integrity policies that exist need to be improved and also need to be enforced so that political appointees are aware of those policies and abide by them. But it's not sufficient to have an agency such as NOAA have a scientific integrity policy if the department that it is part of, the Department of Commerce, ignores that policy. And so there needs to be harmonization and mutual respect for the integrity of science at all levels within the federal government. So those are some of the few ideas, but I'm happy to explore others if that would be useful.
Yeah, a rather holistic and inclusive process. Mr. Chairman, I don't know how much time I have left. I don't see the clock.
Not a lot. Like 10 seconds.
Let me just quickly ask Dr. Lubachenko. Your testimony highlights the increasing intensity, speed, and water content of tropical storms due to warming water temperatures. Could you expand on impacts warmer water could have on upstate New York?
Certainly, Congressman. The first time you and I interacted was in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, when your district, which is far inland, was flooded in some horrific fashion. And what we are seeing now as climate change changes the hurricanes so that they are more likely to be really strong, more category 4 and 5. They move more slowly. And so when they come up over land, they sit there and dump massive amounts of water like Hurricane Harvey did on Houston. But they also have more water because warmer water and warmer air holds more water. And so there's more water to cause flooding. A paper that just came out last week that I mentioned in my written testimony alludes to the fact that those storms that are more powerful.
Doctor, I'm going to have to wrap up your question, your answer, because everybody's going 1, 2, or 3 minutes over, and we need to.
Yes, sir.
There's other questions and other panelists that need to be asked questions.
Those storms last longer and are more likely to go inland and be more powerful and flood districts like yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Byer, you recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And I want to thank you especially for having this hearing today. And I'm really proud to see the Natural Resources Committee
be a leader on tackling climate. And the American needs to know that our climate conversations happen not just on the land, but also in the water and the ocean too. And for areas that I represent, Northern Virginia, it's just expensive homeowner flooding. But if you move down to Virginia Beach or to Norfolk, you're talking about an entire way of life. The ocean's part of the solution, and we know that full implementation of ocean-based climate solutions could deliver 1/5 of the annual greenhouse gas emission cuts that the world needs by 2050 to keep that temperature below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So I really want to thank the Oceans-Based Climate Solutions Act and Laura, Rachel, Casey, Zach, and Beth, the team at WOW, for creating this comprehensive, meaningful bill led by our chairman. And I'm really pleased that I got to work with Republican Francis Rooney in a bipartisan way to build some of the coastal resiliency pieces that are in this bill. But it's wonderful to see Dr. Lubachenko again. We miss you here, but welcome back. And when we talk about ocean and climate, we often focus locally here on nuisance flooding and Lake Dyke Marsh. But when you think about marshes, how important are they to climate change and the whole idea of blue carbon?
Marshes are incredibly central and important in absorbing carbon and then storing that carbon, locking it away so that it's not part of, it's not contributing actively to climate change. Protecting those marshes and restoring marshes that have been degraded is really smart action that has multiple benefits. Not only does it help mitigate climate change, but those marshes are important nursery areas for fisheries. They provide recreational opportunities, and critically important, they provide buffers against storm surge and winds that are coming ashore. And so for all of those reasons, we need to value the marshes, but also the seagrass beds and the mangroves, depending on what part of the coastline you are living in. And so for you, the marshes and the seagrass beds are the ones that are really important as blue carbon ecosystems. They are a hidden treasure that has just recently been revealed, and we need to make the best use of them possible.
Thank you very much. And I know with a home on the Chesapeake Bay, we look at those grasses every year and their restoration, how important they are. Dr. Leonard, you said we are not drowning, we are fighting. Why are the coastal resiliency pieces in the bill so important?
I think the coastal resilience, thank you for the question. And I think the coastal resiliency pieces in the bill are so important because it is potentially the first acknowledgement of the long time suffering that coastal communities have been going through in recent decades due to the climate crisis. And in particular, for tribal coastal communities, it's the first recognition, both through the Tribal Resilience Program funding provisions in the bill, as well as the relocation funding provisions in the bill, where our harm and our suffering is being acknowledged, and that the federal government is stepping forward to say, you know, we have a fiduciary responsibility, a treaty obligation to meet these relocation needs and to meet the needs of the coastal communities, not only indigenous coastal communities, but other coastal communities who are really suffering right now and are in need of solutions for a path forward so that we can envision ourselves as American citizens who aren't going to be sacrificial lambs for the climate crisis, and that we won't be sort of sacrificed to drown in our homes.
I know my friend, Mr. Graves, is probably not on the call any longer, but you can talk to him about how much of his district has disappeared because of the absence of coastal resiliency. Dr. Crick, I only have just a minute, but the Fourth National Climate Assessment said that more than half of the damage to coastal communities is avoidable if we take well-timed adaptation measures. Are we doing the right thing in this bill to move forward on that?
Yes, definitively. Doing the type of work that is included in this bill will help to impart that coastal resiliency, which will protect coastal communities. And as I've mentioned before, will pay dividends on the original investment to the benefits that come for years beyond.
Thank you all very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Mr. Byers, and let me recognize another important contributor to the legislation, Ms. Bonamici. You're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairman Grijalva, for your leadership on ocean climate action. And thank you to our witnesses for joining us, especially my good friend, Dr. Lubachenko. We live in Oregon, where public access to our majestic coastline has been protected basically by a permanent public easement back since 1913. We know that every person on this planet benefits from a healthy ocean. The ocean covers more than 70% of the planet's surface. It supplies much of the oxygen we breathe, and it regulates our climate, as we've discussed. It's linked to the water we drink, and it's home to more than half of life on the planet. The ocean drives our economy. It feeds, employs, and transports us, and the power of its waves generates clean energy. We can capture this potential to help mitigate the climate crisis. Earlier this year, I joined my colleagues on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We released our bold, comprehensive, science-based climate action plan that sets our nation on a path to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative after. As the co-chair of the House Oceans Caucus and Congressional Estuary Caucus, I'm thrilled that this plan includes many of the pieces of legislation recognizing the power of our ocean as part of the solution. And I appreciate Chair Grijalva's leadership to incorporate many of these recommendations into the Oceans-Based Climate Solutions Act. That includes 4 of my bipartisan bills and 6 bills that I'm co-leading. So Dr. Lubachenko, in your testimony, you noted the value of protecting and restoring blue carbon ecosystems. I know you talked about that with Representative Beyer. And you also worked on the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. That report was released last year and indicated that the protection and restoration of coastal blue carbon ecosystems could prevent approximately 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere by 2050. So my questions are, do we have an accurate map and inventory of blue carbon ecosystems across the country? And how would a better assessment of the sequestration potential of blue carbon ecosystems be useful as the United States looks to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement?
Congressman Bonamici, thank you for doing such an effective job of representing Oregon and your district, but also being such a staunch champion for science and for working in bipartisan ways on so many important pieces of legislation. We really deeply appreciate it. Having the numbers that you cite from the Ocean Panel's report, which I helped oversee, that are the 20%, the 1/5 of the carbon emission reductions needed to get us to the 1.5 degree Paris target, are obviously global numbers. We do not have comparable numbers for the United States, and we need them. That would be an obvious next step to be able to better inform the kinds of actions that would be taken. Knowing how much bang we can get for the buck is critically important. The high-level panel also produced a second report which draws attention to the opportunities to advance climate and ocean synergies through economic restoration in the aftermath of the economic downturn following the COVID pandemic that we're seeing play out again in very real time. And so I just want to draw attention to the importance of that report as you and your colleagues consider these activities moving ahead.
Thank you. And Dr. Lubachenko, as we prepare for the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, I worked with my House and Senate Oceans Caucus colleagues to introduce the Blue Globe Act to rapidly accelerate the collection, management, and dissemination of data on the Great Lakes, ocean, bays, estuaries, and coasts. So this bill will assess the potential for an advanced research project agency, Oceans, or ARPA-O, to help overcome the long-term and high-risk barriers in the development of ocean technologies. So based on your experience at NOAA, how could an ARPA-O help us better understand the effects of the climate crisis on our ocean and coastal communities?
Congressman, as you know, knowledge is power, and having information is golden, because then we know how much we need to do and where, and can be as smart and strategic as possible. And so having both the assessments and the monitoring on an ongoing basis so we can see how things are changing, but also the research to understand the processes that are driving climate change and the responses that we're seeing from ecosystems are all critically important to help inform a better understanding of this new world that we are in that's a climate changed world. So great opportunities. Thank you for your leadership in moving those ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Lubachenko, and all the witnesses. And Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your leadership, and I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you very much, Puerto. Let me, now that members are done with their questions, let me ask my questions as we wrap up this hearing. I once again to thank the witnesses. I have a set of questions that I'll be submitting to the panelists for their response. The questions are specific to them, but I'm not really going to go off of those at this point because a couple of the points of discussion, I want to thank Dr. Leonard. I think your points on parity and resource investment for tribes and for regional efforts, tribal regional efforts, parity at the table, and parity in terms of incorporating data and science coming from indigenous knowledge is very good, and I appreciate that point, and it's something that needs to be looked at in the legislation. Part of what we're going to hear in almost any discussion on climate change, and I want to thank the WOW staff and the leadership of Mr. Hauptman for bringing the issue of oceans and the important role they play in the abatement of climate change and the climate crisis that we're confronting to a center point, and to making our response a much more comprehensive response from this committee. And I want to thank the staff for their fine work and the leadership of the subcommittee for making sure, and committee members in general for making sure that this becomes part of a comprehensive response to climate change, along with land and initiatives that are also part of another piece of legislation. Dr. Lubachenko, one of the points that we're going to hear over and over again, that we really can't talk about climate change regarding the oceans because it's about job loss. It's about the destruction of energy independence as we know it. It's about hurting American families with rising energy costs, and it is having to play with bad actors like Russia. In this instance, a bad actor. In other instances, to the administration, not so bad. And then I think the other point that kind of wrapped up that was, let's talk about real science-based discussions and formulation of legislation going forward, because the legislation before us is based on emotion and not science. I mean, those are the messages we're going to hear as this legislation goes forward, and it is going forward. I think it's incumbent on us in the House of Representatives, at least, to lay a template out about how we need to respond to climate change, and this is one of them. So, Dr. Lubachenko, emotion, not science. I appreciated your discussion on integrity that you had with Mr. Tonko. That was excellent as well. But if we're going to put science and empirical information, in fact, at the head of the table, does this make this legislation that we're talking about today merely an emotional, feel-good response?
Mr. Chairman, we continue to be saddled with a very unfortunate framing that many people have bought into, that we have to choose between the economy and the environment. And I think that's absolutely false. And this bill really provides a pathway for both protecting and restoring ocean ecosystems in ways that generate economic benefit, and that also reduce the impacts of climate change that are so economically devastating, and so devastating to people who have fewer options, be they poor people or BIPOC communities. And those the current impact of climate change is devastating to the economy, to our health, to economic opportunities, as well as to life on Earth. And so it is imperative that we tackle this urgent problem of climate change. This bill has many key provisions for doing exactly that. But not only can we tackle climate change using ocean-based solutions, but doing so brings multiple other benefits. And so we
Thank
have
you.
huge opportunities.
But let me just state that I really think having science as the crucible by which we forward legislation, I'm absolutely in favor of that, totally. And the more that we have fact-driven and science-driven decisions around issues of the environment and climate change, the better off the American people are going to be in terms of some progress. But I don't want to spend going through the whole debate about the validity of some science versus the lack of validity of other science. I think we're way past that question, and I don't plan to relitigate that whole point over again, period. But I do think that going forward, as we plan to introduce this legislation in the next session, based on your comments and the continued feedback that we're getting, we'll hope to make the legislation even better, and incorporating some of the points that were made today. I think we need to deal with it, and to ignore it, to put it off, and to go from denial to avoidance on climate change is not progress. And we have much to catch up on. Nothing has happened for 4 years. In fact, on the contrary, much has happened to make the situation even worse. So we have to repair, and this is a repair legislation. And I hope that as we go forward, we continue to welcome your input. To my colleagues and members, thank you today. And to the panel, appreciate very, very much your information, and we will be forwarding individual questions to you. Again, thank you, and no other comment. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.